8 May 1945. Munich, Schwanthalerhall. A municipal clerk named Karl Hoffmann, 29, wrote in a schoolboy notebook he had salvaged from a bombed classroom, "The war did not end today. It moved inside us, and we will buy bread with our silence." It was a dangerous sentence. It could not have been said aloud, not in a city where people were still counted, still registered, still watched, not in a street where uniforms had changed color, but authority remained a ledger with names and decisions. It said too much. It said that there would be bargains. It said that the past would be paid for in whispered deals and unspoken omissions. It said that survival would be arithmetic. He wrote it with a blunt pencil. The page shook on a chipped windowsill. The building across the courtyard was missing a wall, and the morning light fell into apartments like an X-ray. The immediate order of the day was rubble. In the occupation reports, Munich was described as an extremely heavily damaged urban center. The percentage of destroyed housing stock varied by district. The arithmetic of stone took on a bureaucratic calm. 200 million cubic meters of rubble across German cities, the Allied engineering summaries estimated. One report from the US. Office of Military Government, Bavaria, dated June 1945, listed labor availability among women as a line item next to removal of debris and salvage of usable brick. The men were gone, dead, missing, captured. The women sorted, stacked, chipped. Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. A woman named Lotte S., interviewed 4 decades later, said into a cassette recorder, "I chipped mortar off broken bricks. My hands bled. We formed chains and passed the pieces. We did not talk much. The bomb dust made a taste in the mouth." She had been photographed by a soldier, then written up in an Allied intelligence summary as evidence of civic morale. Karl watched from behind a wall where plaster dust formed dunes on the floor. He had not fought. A weak lung had kept him out of the front. He had been a junior clerk for the municipal food office and then a fill-in for the fire brigade during the last months when photographs and files no longer mattered. He sent form letters acknowledging the missing. He stamped cards for bread and potatoes. He wrote a name on the missing list. His father, last letter, March 1945, from the Hunsrück, a temp assignment, then nothing. His childhood friend, conscripted in 1943, last seen in Hungary. His neighbor's son, described in an interrogation report as possibly killed in an air raid. 250,000 Munich residents had left or been killed, the occupation records said. The mathematics of absence had become a ledger without credits. The Allied occupation began on a Friday for Karl Street. US soldiers on jeeps, a megaphone announcing curfews. No one outside after 2100. Weapons to be surrendered, radios to be handed in, then returned, then licensed. Public offices reopened under supervision. The American acronym preceded every department, OMGUs. It sounded like a telegraph code, but it ran the city. On the first day, the soldiers stopped an elderly man who had a Hitler portrait under his arm, removed for firewood. "You must surrender it," an MP said. He took the portrait and leaned it against a pile of bricks with other confiscated things. No one noted the irony. Fear was everywhere. Fear of retribution, fear of drunken soldiers, fear of neighbors making accusations, fear that all else would be added to the file. There were rapes, there were thefts, there were thefts, there were thefts, there were small mercies. A public opinion survey in October 1945 summed up the mood. Population expresses gratitude for cessation of bombing, expresses anxiety for future, desire for food and order. The language was cool, the feelings were not. Karl read the posted ordinances with his clerk's attention. He saw the stamps. He understood that he had to be careful with words. He kept his notebook under a floorboard. The first winter after the surrender was called the such-and-such winter in bureaucratic prose. In names, it became the Hunger Winter. Calories dropped to the lower margins of sustainability. In February 1947, the OMGUS weekly reports estimated daily rations for the general population in some areas at 1,000 to 1,500 calories. The mathematics of a day became exacting and cruel. A ration card granted 500 grams of bread per day. Intop soups watered to translucence. Roots masquerading as potatoes. Children counted slices. The ration card lines became social theatres. Skirts that had been curtains. Coats that had been someone else's. Tattoos invisible under sleeves. The same faces every morning, every week. The city bureaucracy stamped, recorded, and rationed hardship. Food theft up, noted a Munich police report, December 1946. Coal theft up, noted another. In Cologne, the Archbishop had preached a sermon that people remembered, and later a slang verb formed around his name, fringsen, to steal food or coal to survive. The moral vocabulary shifted around the stoves. The currency did not hold. Reichsmarks tumbled into irrelevance. The mathematics of money became a comedy without punchlines. Goods had a price in cigarettes. 2 American cigarettes could purchase a kilo of butter, or a service. The cigarette market is the only functioning market, noted an Allied intelligence summary from November 1945. Cigarettes money, wrote Karl in a margin, as if he were taking notes in a seminar. He sold a violin that had belonged to his father to buy fat. He traded his winter coat for a ration of coal and cut up ruins for firewood. The ledger was brutal. Things went out. Bread and heat came in. In a notebook dated January 1947, a woman in Nuremberg wrote, "We boiled the wallpaper. There is flour in the paste." Another ledger kept its entries just outside the German cities, behind fences, in segregated camps with Allied guards and medical staff. Displaced persons, DPs, former forced laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, Jews who could not go home because home was gone or waited for them with hostility, Poles, Ukrainians, Balts. The maps in Allied headquarters drew circles around them and assigned numbers. The language was careful and administrative. The bodies were not. The DP camp at Feldafing, near Munich, took over a former Hitler youth school. The first arrivals in late April 1945 had travelled by foot from liberation sites. They slept under eaves and on gymnasium floors. An Allied report called them people without nations. The survivors called themselves Jews. They organized schools and newspapers within weeks. They demanded emigration visas. They refused German labor and refused to be called German. "We are a nation of survivors," wrote a journalist in the camp paper. "We will not repair the homes of our murderers." The camp was 3 tram rides and a walk from Karl Street. He never went inside. He had no pass. He saw the faces at the fence. He saw times stiffen around numbers tattooed on forearms. He saw a boy hold up a sheet of paper with a list of names on it. He saw an MP wave him away when he drew too close. He had grown up with one Jewish classmate. He remembered the day in 1938 when the man's father had not come back after a night the adults whispered about. He remembered the empty store window. He remembered how his mother had told him not to ask. He wrote in his notebook, November 1945, "They say nothing of what was done in our name can be said in public. They show films. People look away." The Allied authorities did show films. They brought townspeople into cinemas and forced them to watch footage of the camps. The people chose to disbelieve or to bracket. "It cannot have been like that," said one woman to a survey taker. An OMGUS public opinion survey in December 1946 concluded, while majority expresses horror at atrocities, significant proportion minimizes extent or denies knowledge. These were not just the mathematics of denial. They were also the geometry of proximity. Some cities were close to camps. Some saw trains. Many did not. "We did not know everything," wrote Karl. "We did not want to know." Denazification was the word on the forms. Entnazifizierung. It had a schedule and categories and committees. The process was meant to be justice through paperwork. It became an algorithm for stability. The question was simple. Who had been what? Which party card? Which office? Which uniform? The questionnaire had 131 questions in some zones. They asked about affiliations, donations, attendance, friendships, beliefs. The Sprüchkammern, the tribunals, sat in municipal buildings and read answers. They assigned 5 categories. Category I, Hauptschuldige, major offenders. Category 2, Bellastate offenders. Category 3, Minderbellastate, lesser offenders. Category 4, Mitläufer followers. Category V, Entlastet, exonerated. The law sounded harsh. The arithmetic was forgiving. The majority fell into categories 4 and V. Anyone could collect Perselschein, literally Perselschein, literally Perzel certificates, the joke said, from a brand of detergent letters from friends and neighbors vouching for decency. He helped me with bread. He never denounced anyone. He had to join. The Sprüchkammer files are thick with such phrases, folded into envelopes and then rubber-stamped. Karl's file sits in a drawer in a Bavarian archive. The page is dated 12 March 1947. The subject, Hoffmann, Karl, B21, Feb. 1916, Clark, City of Munich. He had joined the party in 1939 because he felt he had to. He had paid dues twice. He had not held office. He had been a group treasurer for a winter charity once because someone asked him to balance the books. He wrote that he had refused a party loan because he did not want to be indebted. He attached a Perselschein from a janitor who said that Karl had helped a sick wife in 1944. He attached a letter from a priest who called him inwardly distant. The tribunal wrote a single-word conclusion under Category 4, Mitläufer, follower. A fine to be paid in installments. Loss of certain employment for a period. No imprisonment. No public shaming. Reintegration possible after review, the clerk added. Karl returned to the office in late 1947 as a temporary supplemental clerk. He did not miss the irony. The mathematics of guilt sorted the atrocious into the statistical. In the US zone, about 5% were treated as Bellastate or Hauptschuldig. Around 90% slid into Mitläufer or lower. The Sprüchkammern processed millions of questionnaires. The bureaucracy overwhelmed the principle. "The system can no longer bear the burden," wrote an American officer in 1948. "We need trained officials." Denazification ended not with a flourish but with fatigue. Amnesties came in waves. Laws in 1949-1951. Article 31 regulated the return of former civil servants. Police chiefs who had signed arrest warrants in 1938 took back their desks and wore new lapels. Judges who had sentenced an anti-Nazi to prison in 1937 wrote rulings for a constitution. The mathematics of rebuilding demanded hands that had learned to file, stamp, schedule, and sign in another era. The ledger of guilt closed and reopened under a different heading. It was never balanced. Return defined the months and years. People returned from camps, from prisons, from the East. Millions of Germans expelled from the territories lost. Silesia, East Prussia, the Sudetenland. They arrived in western towns by train and truck. Some came on foot, pushing carts with cast-iron pots and feather beds carefully bundled. Women led children. Old men dragged limiters. The scale exceeded description. 12 million, wrote the Federal Ministry for Refugees in its post-war white paper. 8 million to the western zones alone, estimated British reports. The numbers numbed. The arithmetic of the room became a new discipline. The Wonong Samt Housing Office received orders to assign newcomers to rooms in houses that still stood. The rule was simple. Each person needs 6 square meters. A 4-room apartment would suddenly be registered as 12 persons. The newcomers' fees were light. The host's anger was heavy. The state needed social peace. The office needed to avoid riots. Carl's supervisor asked for his help at the housing desk in September 1946. He had a calm voice and good handwriting. He saw behind the counters a civil war in whispers. "I have 2 children," said a local woman. She had a badge with a black band, her husband's death. "I will not share my kitchen." In the next line, a Silesian widow said, "I have 3 children." She had an affidavit from the Red Cross that her husband had died in 1945. "We slept in a barn for 2 months. A police memo, 3 October 1946. Tension increasing between locals and expellees. Occasional fights. Rumors of theft. No serious incidents. Recommend continued ration distributions on schedule." The mathematics of scarcity had rules. Rooms were divided by curtains. Kitchens by timetables written in pencil on the wall with a ruler. Monday, Silesians, Tuesday, locals. Bathrooms by locks. An oral history recorded in the 1970s from a woman in Augsburg remembered the emotions. "They came in wearing coats of rough cloth. They had different accents. Sometimes they cried for no reason. We took the walls for our own missing and set the table for someone else's loss. In the evening, we all listened to the same radio." This was not charity. It was a coerced arithmetic. It changed biographies. Children went to new schools. Priests wrote letters to other priests. Clubs signed up new members. Some marriages were made in kitchens. Some resentments lasted decades. "They called us Polacks," an expellee recalled, even though she had never set foot in Poland. The word Heimat, once a warm place tied to hills and dialect, became a cold memory of a registry entry. The winter of 1946 to 47 was the worst. Coal shipments slowed. Coal was needed for railroad locomotives and for heating and for industry, and someone had to choose which carriages moved. British Control Commission minutes in January 1947 speak of impossible decisions. Hospitals and bakeries were given priority. Schools were closed to save heat. A lake in Munich froze as if painted. People chopped ice from the Isar. The mathematics of heat turned into shared body heat. People lay two to a bed because a single person under a blanket could not get warm enough to sleep. Carl developed a cough that did not leave him. He lit a fire in the oven with 2 chair legs. He felt ashamed. He helped to distribute coal as part of a work detail in exchange for extra rations, a common arrangement. He took 1 briquette in his pocket and felt it burn through the fabric of his coat. He wrote down the numbers because numbers gave him a sense that choices were not barbaric or random. He wrote, "At 1,100 calories a day, work becomes shaky. At 900, the hands tremble." He wrote, "We become calculators." He stood beside a bridge one morning when a column of former Wehrmacht men came into the city. They were POWs who had just been released somewhere on the other side of the Rhine. They were thin. Some wore mismatched boots. They formed lines at the registration office and then at the soup kitchen. A municipal report recorded their names and gave them ration cards and said, "They will be absorbed." Absorption is a chemical word. It assumes a solvent and a solute. The city was the solvent. The men dissolved into lines at the labor office. Some of them had no work to dissolve into. "Wounds you cannot see," wrote a British psychiatrist in an Allied memo about demobilized German soldiers and civilians in February 1946. Sleep disturbances, nightmares, irritability. But the police do not arrest you for nightmares. The war had moved inside. It sent triggers. It sent paving stones of memory. In a house in Munich, it sent a sound in the middle of the night that made a neighbor run to the cellar because it resembled a siren. In Karl's building, it sent a smell of burning hair when the neighbors butchered a rabbit. He did not write about these. He wrote the ledger entries that made things appear neat. The public memory was being organized. Films were released. In the Soviet zone, a film called Die Mörder sind unter uns, The Murderers Are Among Us, opened on 15 October 1946 with sound of steps in hallways and a doctor's conscience. In the Western zones, films arrived that looked away, Heimat filmy with mountains and cows. It was not escapism as much as social stabilizer. A report from the U.S. Army Information Control Officers said, "Need for morale. Building content is high. Audience rejects heavy-handed moralizing. Accepts positive depictions of work, family." The entertainment rethreaded the net. Karl read newspapers on his lunch break. Some were new. Some carried old names under new editors. They published stories of bomb destruction and of daring rescues. They ran human interest stories on ex-Belie families and their search for relatives. They wrote little about those who had lived behind fences. They published official photographs of the Nuremberg trials, but often without the sentences attached. An Allied survey of public opinion in August 1947 concluded, "Trial news excites interest, not introspection." He put the paper away, finished his soup, returned to the office. Money changed on a Sunday. 20 June 1948. People queued at distribution points. New bills, new color, the Deutsche Mark. The numbers recalibrated. At 6 a.m., people walked into street markets. By noon, price tags were handwritten and honest for the first time in years. Shopkeepers pulled real goods out of back rooms. The black market collapsed because its algebra had been recalculated. "It was as if rain had fallen on dusty fields," wrote a woman in a letter to her sister. The letter appears in a family collection in the Staatsbibliothek and has a coffee stain in the corner. The currency reform was not a miracle. It was a rule change. It removed the mathematics of evasion and replaced it with a mathematics of growth. The Marshall Plan shipments that began in 1948 and 1948 and 1949 delivered grain and milk powder and machinery. The photos are at the Bundesarchiv, crates stamped ERP for the European Recovery Program, winched from cargo ships and stacked in ports. The numbers in ministry reports show investments in railways, factories, and housing stock. Ludwig Erhard's talk of a social market economy found ears in bakeries because bread was on the shelf. Factories reopened that had not been dismantled. Some that had been dismantled were rebuilt with new partners and new names. Volkswagen resumed making cars under the British, then under German management. The roar returned to a slow roar. The coal wagons rolled. It was power, and it was a story. Wirtschaftswunder, the press called it, the economic miracle. It was neither a miracle nor a myth. It was steel, risk, and a bargain with the past. Karl took a job in late 1948 at a small electrical equipment firm housed in a repaired building near the main train station. He had applied through a Catholic charity that placed reliable men in reliable enterprises. His task was to reconcile purchase orders. He checked numbers and learned to read the new abbreviations for taxes and foreign currency. He liked the paper that was no longer grey and thin. He liked the smell of oil and machine grease in the factory hall because it meant production. He also attended a lecture series in the evening given by a former judge, now hired to teach civic education at the Volkshochschule. The judge spoke of the new basic law, the Grundgesetz, which was to be adopted in May 1949. He spoke of rights and of dignities and of responsibilities. "Never again," he said, 3 times. Karl wrote the words but did not underline them. He felt a heat behind the eyes he could not account for. The judge had signed arrest warrants in 1937. The classmates did not mention it. The necessity of forgetting wore a respectable jacket and a tie. The Cold War simplified the calculus. The mathematics of guilt, once a domestic argument, became an international equation. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic in October 1949. The Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949. Americans and British helped write the laws. Russians wrote laws in the East. Voices were trained to sound like the future. In the West, the government under Konrad Adenauer was pragmatic about personnel. Anti-communism was a job qualification. Clerks, policemen, teachers once removed were returned to service. The 131 law in 1951 regulated the re-employment of former civil servants. The need for trained staff outweighs the desire for thorough house cleaning, wrote an Allied observer with a tired hand. The statistics are in the Bundesarchiv. A significant percentage of senior officials in ministries had pre-1945 careers. The trade unions agreed to compromises. The churches did too. Stability became a confession of faith. Karl's supervisor at the factory had once been a block leader. Now he taught the apprentices to calculate piecework. Schoolbooks taught a truncated past. They had pages on the 30 Years' War and on Bismarck. They had a few paragraphs on 1933. They had more on 1943 and 1945. They described bombings. They described evacuation. They described down to the exact weight the luggage a child could carry. They wrote about expulsion. They had photographs of wagons. The perpetrators were nouns without faces, the Nazis. The victims were first-person plural, we. A 1953 Bavarian schoolbook dealt with the camps in 6 lines. It spent 2 pages on ration cards in 1946. The emphasis made a certain sense to the people in the classrooms. It made another sense to those outside them. Contact with the victims became thinner. DP camps emptied. By 1950, most had closed. Survivors emigrated to the new state of Israel, to the United States, to Canada. Some remained in Germany because they had nowhere else to go. Restitution files arrived at municipal offices. Return of shops and apartments seized under alienation laws 10 years earlier. The files were thick and polite. The language was careful. We ask that the property at X, formerly held by Y, be returned as per law Z. There were delays. There were complications, third parties, post-war destroyed registries, people who had purchased in apparent good faith. Karl worked 1 afternoon a week in the city office handling property tax bills. He saw a file stamped with an old date. The name on it was familiar. The shop had sold trousers when he was 12. The owner had emigrated in 1939 under pressure. The building had been bombed. The lawyer acting for the heirs sought compensation through a fund that had too little money and too few staff. "We must prioritize living claimants," said a memo. The case sat in a file basket painted grey. It waited for someone to lift it. He lifted it and found he could do nothing. He noted the invoice sent in error to a dead man's address and had it corrected. It was not a heroic act. It was a correction of a line. The cemetery of documents is the place where a society buries and resurrects fragments of conscience. "A file does no justice," wrote a philosopher. "It hides an appeal for justice in a paperclip." The arithmetic of administration had something pitiless about it. It rejected quarrels, replaced them with categories and predictable delays. Karl understood this intimately. He also understood that the new currency and the steady job were telling him something simple: keep your head down. Learn the names of the men who would hire again. Use your pencil above your mouth. The public commemorations followed. War memorials received new plaques. Den Opfern des Krieges, they said, to the victims of war. Den Opfern von Flucht und Vertreibung, they said, to the victims of flight and expulsion. The sermons picked careful words. A pastor in October 1952 said, "We mourn the victims of war on all sides." The phrase dissolved history into symmetry. It soothed many. It angered a few. The past was an object emptied of content and filled with sadness. It was a broom whose function was to sweep, not to scratch behind furniture. The Cold War offered another ledger. The Federal Republic joined the European coal and steel community in 1951. It tied Ruhr coal to French furnaces. The NATO debate roiled in the early 1950s. Rearmament, soldiers again, a different uniform. It alarmed some. It comforted others. It proved to the Americans that the Germans were reliable. It proved to the Germans that they had a seat at the table. The memory of the Eastern Zone hardened into a saying, "Better the West than the rest." It was a joke with a border in it. In the background, men returned from prisons long after the trials ended. Some had been guards. Some had been administrators. They came back because of small amnesties or because legal machinery had worn out. They took new names. They lived in small apartments. Some came to Karl's office to ask for ration cards and were told that rationing was ending. The city clerk who had once stamped their work permits in 1938 now stamped their tax forms in 1938, now stamped their tax forms in 1955. It had a polished dullness, a permanence not of monuments but of file cabinets. Men and women carried their own cabinets in their heads, memory drawers that opened with a squeal. The nights were heavy. A study by a Munich psychiatrist in 1955 described patterns: hyperarousal, recurrent recollection, avoidance. These terms would later be named post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1955, they were called nerves or late war damage. There were few places to talk. Men spoke at the Stammtisch of soccer injuries and of the price of pork. Women spoke under their breath at the laundry. Children listened. Some children learned to ask nothing. Karl married in 1950. His wife had escaped from Königsberg and had 3 scars on her hands. She did not talk about how she had received them. She worked as a seamstress and then at the factory packing department. They had a son in 1952. He slept in a drawer for the first month because the cradle had been assigned to a cousin by the housing office. They moved into a new apartment in 1954 with a balcony and a proper kitchen. Karl stood on the balcony and felt something like pride, cautious and complicated. He taught his son to count. He showed him how to fold ration cards even when rationing was over, because the habit of caution felt like a moral. He attended a parent meeting at the school. A teacher from Swabia spoke about the new civics lessons. Someone raised a question about the past. The teacher replied, "We must look forward." On a Sunday in 1955, a ceremony unveiled a war memorial in a square not far from the factory. The mayor spoke of sacrifice. The brass band played. People wore their best clothes. Passers-by stopped and thought of their own dead. A man in a dark coat said to no one in particular, "It is good to have a place to put the flowers." A banner in the background said, "Never again war," and a banner in the foreground said, "Our homeland in the east." The 2 pieces of cloth fluttered in the same wind and did not touch. Some days later, Karl walked past the new memorial and into his office cubicle. He opened a file. It carried the name of a person who had not come back. He wrote a note in neat script, closed the file, and placed it in a basket. His hand hesitated as it passed over the metal rim. He thought of the Stundenzettel on his desk, timesheets, and of how he had learned to measure life in hours worked and meals eaten and lines written and lines not written. He thought of 8 May 1945, and of the line he had written on a windowsill about silence and bread and the war moving inside. The years moved around him. The factory increased production. The apprentices learned to operate new machines imported from America. The boss set a plaque on the wall in honor of the founder. The founder had died in 1943. The plaque did not mention why. It did not need to. The holes in the wall from the war had been plastered smooth. Carl's wife brought home a book in 1956. It was a novel about war by an author who had not fought. It had a cool tone. It felt modern. He read it and put it aside and thought that sometimes polite distance told a story better than the old words shouted. He remembered the men who had shouted and the words they had used and the way words had become crimes. He felt that careful writing was like careful accounting. It rescued something small from violence. He opened his notebook and wrote a sentence: "We live with bargains we do not describe." The occupation ended formally in 1955, replaced by treaties and alliances. The American flag still flew at a barracks near Carl Street. The soldiers had cars now. They had wives and children. They shopped at the PX. Some of the young Germans had American friends. Some had resentments. Most had television sets or wanted to. The economy moved faster. It produced goods whose names gave pleasure rather than anxiety. The mathematics of household budgets began to include radios and holidays and washing machines. The old calculus of ration cards faded to memory. The new calculus of mortgages and installments took its place. A letter arrived in 1957 that broke the arithmetic. It was from the Red Cross tracing service. It said that there was now certainty that his father had died in March 1945. The war had ended 12 years before, and now the mathematics of the missing closed to a period. His father's name had a date next to it. It meant nothing in terms of food or rooms. It meant something in the grammar of a life. He went to the cemetery and stood before the stone that had always said "missing," and the stonemason carved a year behind the name. He thought about how a system can produce closure without producing peace. He walked home past streets that all had names once changed and then changed back. He bought bread at a bakery that sold rolls called Schrippen, then semmeln, then Brotchen as refugees, locals, and national broadcasts contested dialect. He bought a pack of cigarettes with proper money for the first time in his life, not to barter, just to keep for a moment as a small trophy of normalcy. He lit one on the balcony and looked down onto a courtyard where a child pulled a toy car on a string. The toy was red. The string was white. The courtyard was clean. He took out the notebook with the first sentence. He read his younger hand. He added a date at the bottom of the page and wrote below it in neat print, "I wrote this to bind myself to a truth." Then, it was true. The war did not end. It moved into us. We used silence as currency. We paid with compromise. We paid less than the debt. We paid enough to eat. We paid enough to sleep. We did not pay enough to forget. He closed the notebook. He placed it next to his pencil. He went to work. He checked the columns in the ledger. He corrected a misprint in an invoice. He waited for the lunch bell. He carried his soup into the canteen and ate it with men who had their own notebooks inside their heads that no one would open in public. He wiped his mouth and returned to his desk. In 1960, a young prosecutor in Frankfurt began to assemble evidence for a case against men who had worn uniforms in a camp. The newspapers wrote more. The radio spoke names that had not been spoken in rooms like Carl's in a decade. People read and said, "So it was. We knew. We did not know." The words came back with new force. The children in school asked questions in class that could not be answered in 6 lines. The past took a second breath in public. It did not reshape Carl's work. It did reshape the time he spent awake at night. A man who had been an apprentice in 1948 returned to the factory in 1963 as a manager. He thanked Carl for teaching him to keep his numbers straight. He called him a pillar. He asked him to speak at the retirement party for the old production chief, a man with a tight jaw and small blue eyes. People clapped. The clapping covered the pass like snow. Carl's son asked him one day what he had done during the war. "I cut bricks," he said. It was both true and insufficient. The boy wanted a larger narrative. The father had learned to cut sentences like bricks. He had learned the mathematics of answers in a time and place where equations had changed savagely and then again. He wrote more in his notebook in 1965. He had seen a documentary on television with black and white footage he had seen before and would see again. He wrote, "Seeing is not the same as bearing." He wrote, "We are guilty by mathematics, just as we are innocent by mathematics." Sums done in a time of scarcity. Denazification was a calculus. Expulsion was an abacus. The Cold War was a ledger with 2 columns. We balanced as small bookkeepers in a city of debts. This is not to justify, it is to count. He put the book back under the socks in the drawer. The rubble was gone by then. The Trümmerfrauen grew old. They sat on benches in summer and watched store windows change. The garbage men wore orange uniforms. The streets did not smell, except sometimes in heat, and then only a little. The beer gardens were full again, in particular evenings of cheerful noise. The laughter was mostly ordinary. It was relief made into habit. The statistics in the newspapers were UI employment rates, not calories per day or cubic meters of rubble removed. The people who read them were different and the same. He still sometimes woke at night with a sound in his head, something like a siren but not quite, and the smell of singed hair. He turned and put his feet on the floor and sat, and then stood and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water and counted in his head. He counted to 100. He counted to 120. He counted the names in his changed city. He counted the documents in his drawers. He counted the bargains he had made without wanting to, and the bargains he had made gladly. And he found that the ledger of his own life had agreed with his first frightening sentence. He respected that sentence as one respects a difficult friend. Bundesarchiv records list the city contracts his signature had touched. Occupation reports show how many windows had been reglazed by 1949 in his district. Denazification files summarized the tribunals of men he knew by sight. Allied intelligence summaries measured the distance between words and knowledge and never bridged it. Oral histories from expellees and Trümmerfrauen and veterans and survivors capture sentences like arrows striking a wall and falling to the floor. No single document binds them. A narrative walks around them and tries to gather them under a logic of time and responsibility. There is no exoneration in arithmetic. There is no demonization that accomplishes anything in a ledger. There is only the calm of counting and the shock of remembering. Carl came to love both because they made him feel useful and honest. He understood that those words had been deployed in a past he wanted to set aside. He also understood that the point was not to feel good, but to be exact where one could. He wrote one last entry in his notebook late one night in 1968, when students were shouting in the streets and the newspapers amused themselves by comparing them to the people of 1933. He wrote, "They will not hear us, the ones who live with the numbers. They will accuse us of cowardice, and we will deserve in part the accusation. They have the luxury of not counting. We had to count to not be counted. This, too, is a sin and a defense." He put the book away. He closed the drawer. He slept a plain sleep. In the end, the sum of his life in those years was not a general's report or a heroic poster. It was a stack of files, a drawer of ration cards, a series of apartment assignments made under duress, a fair wage earned under rules built with careful compromises, a marriage that stood, a child taught to ask, and a quiet knowledge that the front line after 1945 had run along his hands and into his memory, through his pencil and across his paperwork, not across a battlefield.